Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. Today I have for you a presentation titled Guns in America, a Civil Conversation in Uncivil Times. It was recorded earlier this summer in California, and it really brings together my most mature thinking about the issue of guns, the culmination of 12 years of trying to engage this issue in a civil and complex manner. I'm grateful for an invitation from the Central Coast Chapter of the California Rifle and Pistol Association to give this talk to members of their organization, but also to members of their community. Good evening, everyone, and thanks especially to Tracy Weed and the San Luis Obispo Chapter of the California Rifle and Pistol Association for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm super excited to be here and grateful for all of you for taking some time out of your surely busy schedules to be here. And I know that Tracy really wanted to get a diverse group of people from the community out to the event. He tried to do as much outreach as he could. So that we can try to have some better conversations about guns across our differences. And I don't know whether he succeeded, but let me begin with some questions for you all to see who all we have here. So first of all, who all is in favor of gun safety? If you're in favor of gun safety, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, good. I'm worried about you. No, okay, just a little, okay. How about everybody who's opposed to preventable gun deaths? Raise your hand. Okay, all right, that's good, good. All of you who see yourselves as gun rights activists, any gun rights activists out there? Quite a few. And how about gun violence prevention activists? Anybody out there who sees themselves as a gun? Okay, wow. So we have a lot in common, right? We have some differences, but that's an amazing place to start a conversation, right? We have commonalities and we also have some differences. And I'm really particularly appreciative of you all coming out tonight because, quite frankly, it's not easy to talk about guns in American society. We had this conversation over dinner that guns can often be a conversation stopper more than a conversation starter. And guns are just a divisive issue, and we might even say it's a wedge issue in our increasingly polarized political culture. And I would even go so far as to say that for some people, guns is a four-letter word, right? Four-letter word being a euphemism for words that are considered profane or offensive. And I've met many people who feel this way about guns, right? They see them really as like smut, right? These are things that should not be displayed or discussed in polite company, okay? When I tried to get Claude AI to generate the graphic that was on the previous slide, it refused to do it, right? And I get it, as I'll explain later in this talk, when I talk about my own background. I understand why some people don't want anything to do with guns, including talking about them. Now, those people probably aren't here tonight, but props to anybody who's here who is gun curious or gun skeptical. Right? You came out, and hopefully you'll think that this was a good use of your time, that we will be able to engage in a civil conversation about guns in our quite uncivil times. Now, the logo that you see on my slides really expresses my motto when it comes to engaging the gun issue. Light over heat. I always want to promote understanding, right, over anger. And I'm happy to say that I have succeeded sometimes in doing this. Ranjit Singh, who wrote a very generous review of my book, said, in a national environment in which political discourse is passionate, heated, and often angry, Yamani brings a refreshing Bob Ross-like calmness that's much needed. And this is probably one of the greatest compliments that I've ever been paid, and as you can see, I ran with it. In seriousness, it's really a privilege to be with you here tonight. I want to share a little bit about my background, how I became a gun owner, and why it matters, and then draw some lessons that I've learned from what is now a 14-year journey inside America's gun culture. And I definitely want to leave some time for conversation at the end. So how did a liberal professor become an armed American? As Tracy mentioned, I grew up in a little town called Half Moon Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. So it was a land of unicorns and rainbows in which I played sports. I revered Martin Luther King. I fought against apartheid in South Africa. And it really was a gun-free bubble that kept me from thinking seriously about guns, either positively or negatively. Guns were just not a part of my social and cultural reality. And that gun-free bubble followed me from high school to college at UC Berkeley and to graduate school at Wisconsin and to my first job at Notre Dame. And at each stage of my education and work, that blue bubble that I existed in became bluer. And as I got into sociology, that blue bubble became the deepest, richest, most vibrant color of blue possible. But then in 2025, I moved to Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and my gun-free bubble started to break down under the weight of North Carolina's vibrant and rich gun culture. And soon enough, without looking very hard, I began to see guns all around me. Right? I would see gun shows held at the annex to the arena where Wake Forest played basketball. I'd see street signs on busy corners declaring concealed carry classes. Gun stores and ranges would buy billboard space on local highways advertising their products and services. And even the people, the highly educated professionals that I played tennis with, turned out to be gun nuts, right? So one of my friends, he had a couple of rifles that had been passed down through his families. Another guy, he worked in IT. He, for some reason, had two .40 caliber pistols. My mixed doubles teammate is a real estate agent, would carry a gun when she went to show houses. And sort of soon enough, I began to think I was literally the only person in North Carolina that didn't have a gun. Now, beyond just living in North Carolina, a key turning point in my discovery of guns came in July of 2010 at the Country Inn & Suites in Columbus, Georgia. So I was there for my son's tennis tournament, and we passed time between matches just flipping through channels on the hotel's TV. And by dumb luck, I stumbled onto a marathon of the first season of Top Shot. They were just playing back-to-back episodes. How many people watched Top Shot back in the day? Okay. It was one of my favorite shows. It's unfortunate that it's off the air. But I had no idea that a mainstream television channel would put on a reality show that was based on the premise of Survivor, but was also a shooting gallery on steroids captured on high-speed videography. And what I saw on that show was a revelation to me as someone who had lived in this gun-free bubble. And I always remember the trick shot showdown in the first season, episode 7. So Tara Poremba hit all of her targets with a Winchester Model 1873 rifle, Annie Oakley style, right? Shooting over her shoulder and using a mirror to aim. And then Chris Serino drove 2 out of 3 nails by hitting them on the head with bullets that he fired from a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but the excitement I felt watching these marksmanship skills on Top Shot really planted a seed of interest in firearms in me. Now, I have to give a lot of credit to my wife, Sandy, for cultivating this interest. Sandy, unlike me, is a native North Carolinian. In fact, she grew up in the county next to the county that Winston-Salem is in a town called Moxville. And as you can see, Moxville used to have the distinction, it may still have the distinction, of being the #1 most redneck city in the state of North Carolina. Right? And one of the criteria used for that ranking is the number of gun stores per capita. And I've actually bought a couple of guns from Davey Outfitters, the gun store that they used as the image for that story. So not only were guns a really normal part of Sandy's life growing up in Mocksville, but she also served in the United States Coast Guard. And as she often reminds me, she qualified as an expert with her Beretta M9 pistol. Yeah. Now, I confess to being incredulous when she told me this over peppermint lattes at the Starbucks a few months after I saw Top Shot, because I knew that Sandy served in the Coast Guard, but I didn't have any conception that she would actually carry a sidearm as part of her daily law enforcement responsibilities. I just didn't know anything about guns or gun culture. Another moment later in our relationship highlights how far apart we were in terms of our experience of gun culture. We're driving down a rural stretch of highway just outside of Winston-Salem one afternoon, and I look out in a field and I see this wooden structure that just seemed very out of place in this field. And I said, "Sandy, isn't that a weird spot for kids to build a fort?" Now, she looked at me as if I was from another planet and said, "That's a deer stand." And she also had to explain to me what a deer stand is. But for some reason, she married me anyway. Thanks. Now, so the apparent normality of guns in North Carolina, right? Seeing Top Shot on TV, exposure to the reality of guns through Sandy, combined to inspire in me the idea that I should overcome my ignorance and fear of guns by trying to learn how they work. And so Sandy paved the way for this by hooking me up with one of her high school classmates, Jimmy Staley, who's a trainer for the North Carolina Highway Patrol, and he invited us to his nearby farm to shoot guns. So he loaded up a magazine with 9mm cartridges, put it into his Sig Sauer P226 pistol, handed the gun to me, so showed me how to grip and aim, and said, "Go ahead." And so in January of 2011, as a 42-year-old, I shot a gun for the first time. Yeah, it made a big difference in my life, for sure. We didn't take any photos that day because we didn't think that it was going to be anything special. I just thought that I was going to go learn how guns worked, how to know if they were loaded, unloaded, how to make them safe, and so on. I was so anxious, I don't really remember the first pull of the trigger, but I know it was confirmed by Jimmy and Sandy that I completely missed the target. But as I worked my way through that first magazine, and Jimmy suggested improvements to my grip and stance and sight alignment and trigger press, I walked each consecutive bullet closer to the bullseye. And at the end of the session, Jimmy said, "You did all right." So going in, I expected to be frightened, but instead I had fun and felt challenged. And getting into guns wasn't at all my intention that day, but after shooting fewer than 50 rounds, I was hooked, and I became a gun owner not long after that. So that was the beginning of my journey out of the blue bubble in which I had lived most of my life into the gun culture that I spent the next 12 years participating in and trying to understand for my book, Gun Curious. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think this journey that I've made matters for understanding guns in America. So as a reminder, I'm a sociologist, and in case you didn't know, sociology has been described as the painful elaboration of the obvious. Okay? So I want to begin with the obvious, and then I'll move on to the painful elaboration. Right? The obvious part is that most liberals are not gun owners, and most gun owners are not liberals. Right? But when I became a gun owner, I didn't stop being a liberal. Right? So I exist at the intersection of these two worlds that don't often intersect. Right? Okay, that's the obvious part. So now for the painful elaboration. Anthropologist Victor Turner used the term liminality to describe the condition of being betwixt and between. Now, other people in more plain language describe it as being neither here nor there. Right? So the concept is really originally conceived to describe sort of rites of passage, when a person is moving from one status to another, like from adolescence into adulthood. but it could be used to describe other passages that we may make from one place to another, like moving to a new city, or from one situation to another, like moving into a new job. And Turner thought that this situation of liminality was so intense that most people couldn't spend much time in that, right? You have to settle in somewhere in due time. But some people do experience this condition of being betwixt and between over longer periods, right? So you can think about people who are social exiles, or who are refugees, or people who voluntarily stand outside of normal society, or people who are androgynous in sex or fluid in their gender identity, right? Or think about someone who is liberal and also a gun owner. So I've lived most of my life outside of gun culture, right? And most of my days are spent in my faculty office or in the classroom at an exclusive private university. But I also spend some of every day in contact with gun owners and gun culture. And so this liberal / gun owner hybrid identity, in theory, sort of means I might have two tribes that I could call my own, but in reality, it means that I oftentimes feel homeless, right? Floating between two different worlds, betwixt and between, neither here nor there, or as Victor Turner said, in a liminal state. Okay? Being in a liminal state of having one foot in a world and one foot out of a world can be pretty lonely, in fact. And as a gun owner, I don't always fit into that liberal world that I spend most of my time in, but I also don't fully feel at home in the gun world either, as I'll explain soon enough. Now, liminality is also a special place, as Victor Turner said, that has some clear advantages. So the positive side of being neither here nor there is that it puts me in a position to act as a translator or a mediator between these two different worlds, right? So rather than being neither here nor there, I can try to be both here and there, right? So I can visit the Brady campaign offices in Washington. And I could also be interviewed for a gun podcast at the NRA annual meeting. And I can be with you here tonight, right? So being betwixt and between is a sort of privileged position, and I hope to take advantage of that to some good effect tonight. My book, Gun Curious, is an example of this. Like, I try to model being both here and there in the book. It brings together my personal story of becoming a gun owner with my scholarly understanding of American gun culture and really trying to answer a very simple question, right? Why do guns make sense to people who own them? And my answer to that question is based on the central premise that I've already alluded to tonight, which is that guns are normal and normal people use guns, right? And when I say guns are normal and normal people use guns, I mean it in two different senses. So first, gun ownership is common, widespread, and typical in our society. And second, that guns and gun ownership are not inherently associated with abnormality or deviance. Okay, the idea that guns are normal and normal people use guns is probably pretty obvious to those of you who are members of the California Rifle and Pistol Association, but it's actually a departure from the standard social scientific view of guns, which really focus on deviance as concerns guns, and also from public health studies, which really focus on negative outcomes with firearms. So I try to demonstrate the normality of guns and gun owners in Gun Curious by telling the story of how I became a responsibly armed American and what I learned in the process. And so you can see from the table of contents, I talk about the cultural and even anthropological normality of guns, how I became what a gun journalist called a gun super owner, the very fraught issue of AR-15s and how I've come to be comfortable living with them, my experience of becoming a concealed carry permit holder, the risks and benefits of gun ownership, and the training path I took to become a responsibly armed citizen. And then the book concludes with 5 general lessons I learned in the process. And those 5 lessons, along with 1 bonus lesson, is what I want to spend the balance of my time talking about today. So the first lesson is that shooting is fun. Right? As you know, I didn't shoot a gun for the first time because I thought it would be fun. I thought the guns were scary and I wanted to know how to be safe around them if I ever came across one in North Carolina. But you also know that a funny thing happened during my trip to the gun range for that first visit. I had fun. So recognizing the power of my own experience discovering firearms, when I teach my Sociology of Guns course at Wake Forest, the first thing that we do in the course is take a field trip to the gun range in which students are given the opportunity to shoot a variety of guns. And this past fall, we took that field trip for the 10th consecutive year, and for 10 years running, all of the students left the range with the same number of holes in them that they came with. So that was a success. Now, the goal of the field trip is not to convert people to guns, but the students come away with an experiential understanding of why shooting could be fun, right? And many of them actually do have fun shooting, even if they've never shot a gun before, and they were skeptical about guns going in. So the range field trip is so well known among students in my department that I had a student who couldn't take my course, asked me to take her to the range separately, and as you can see, we had a great time shooting bowling pins on that trip. I've taken my son's foreign exchange student from Argentina to the range. That may have been a felony, I'm not sure, but just between us. I've taken a bunch of friends, and most recently I took my 57-year-old sister who lives in Half Moon Bay, who's never shot a gun before. And all of these experiences and many others that I've had taking people to the range really confirm the saying that there's no such thing as an anti-gun gun range. Now, I recognize that most people don't oppose guns for use in innocuous activities like recreational shooting on a range or collecting. Concerns really center, I think, on defensive gun ownership and use. Right? And to me, this suggests that people aren't really concerned about guns per se, because they don't care if I take it to the range or if I collect guns. Right? But the problem is really something more fundamental, which is the potential for violence that guns embody. Right? Some of this liberal resistance is no doubt due to guns. Right? But I think the gun masks a more fundamental reservation about the capacity for violence that guns represent, and indeed reservations about violence itself, right? And I get that because in my heart and mind, I never want to use violence against anyone unnecessarily. And so I believe with the author of this book, with the author of this book, Tim Larkin, right? He says violence is rarely the answer. Violence is rarely the answer, but I also believe his conclusion that when violence is the answer, it's the only answer, right? There's no alternative to violence in that moment. So, in truth, most liberals are not opposed really to guns or violence altogether. We simply prefer to outsource our violence to law enforcement, right? And where I differ from a lot of my liberal peers is in my recognition that there can be some limited circumstances under which violence can be the answer. That's the second lesson. Now, for some time, I've been arguing that defensive gun culture in particular has the potential to be inclusive because safety and security are universal concerns, and many people will address that concern with firearms. Now, although I do see the culture as potentially inclusive, I've already suggested, I have to say that I may not feel fully at home in that culture. So in January 2021, I was working on an article about gun culture, and I was interrupted by a text from a friend that said, "They are storming the Capitol." And it took me a minute to figure out who they were, but I soon made the connection. They were people wanting to save America by overturning Trump's defeat in the 2020 presidential election. And I was sorry, but I was not surprised to see images from that day of the Confederate battle flag with AR-15s and "Come and Take It" superimposed on them, flying alongside all manner of Trump MAGA flags. And in that image, every negative stereotype that people have about gun culture and gun owners was on full display. Aggrieved white men, firmly rooted in a racially unequal past, flying the flag of their totemic emblem and rallying cry. Now, at the same time, I argued that those who blamed gun culture as a whole for the events of January 6th were making a causal connection that doesn't reflect the reality of guns and gun ownership in America as a whole. Tens of millions of gun-owning Americans, right, are exposed to the NRA's rhetoric, right? They are exposed to gun industry advertising. They engage in social activities around guns, but they're not infected by an alleged insurrectionist mind virus. Okay? And these two different responses I had to the events of January 6th really highlight that duality of repulsion and attraction that I experience relative to gun culture, right? That neither here nor there experience. Now, like many who have come into the gun culture fold, especially since this great gun buying spree that we saw in 2020, I was a new and non-traditional gun owner when I first owned guns in 2011. And every year I become more comfortable in gun culture, though there are still aspects that make me feel less than fully at home. So I really see this as a moment of opportunity for gun culture. Right? The opportunity is to embrace new and non-traditional gun owners in all of their diversity. Right? And to paraphrase my childhood hero, Martin Luther King, I believe the arc of gun culture history is long, but it bends toward inclusion. And if it doesn't bend, then we should bend it. So the fourth lesson I've learned on my journey is that gun owners are and should be and can be more responsible. So again, in the wake of the great gun buying spree of 2020, Atlantic staff writer David Frum made a very ardent, if not exceptionally unique, argument that responsible gun ownership is a lie. And if you can't see the small print in the URL, I'll enlarge it for you there. So I appreciated the fact that Frum clearly stated what he actually thought, because I think a lot of people in the gun control movement really believe this in their hearts, but they sort of soften their political stances or their public stances for political purposes, right? And the reality is, as responsible adults, we engage in risky behavior all the time. Right? We also try to mitigate those risks as much as possible. So driving a car and drinking alcohol are two of the most dangerous things that you can do, statistically speaking. But in my experience, responsible gun ownership is no more a lie than responsible drinking or responsible driving, even though we all know people will irresponsibly combine those two things. Right? And as I show in my book, and I'll highlight with some data shortly, most gun owners will not shoot themselves or anyone else, accidentally or intentionally, and most guns will not be used to injure or kill anyone. And of course, gun owners should be responsible and can be more responsible. Right? And many people in the gun culture are working toward this goal, including Michael Sodini, who I discuss at some length in the book. So Mike is working on bridging the gap between guns and mental health with an organization that he founded called Walk the Talk America. Right? And I encourage you, if you're concerned about suicide, to look into the work that Walk the Talk America is doing. It models responsible gun ownership. Another example I discuss in the book is Rob Pincus's Avidity Arms PD-10 pistol. So the gun is shipped with a Walk the Talk America information card and also a sticker. But I think even more impressive to me is the phrase that's laser cut into the foam. And I think you can see it. It says, "Rights come with responsibilities." right? And that's a motto that I would love to see more people in the gun culture embrace and embody, recognizing that many of you already do that. All right, the fifth and final lesson in Gun Curious is the need to have civil conversations with fellow citizens about guns, right? One of the things that we're trying to model here tonight. And open minds and hearts are as important now as they have ever been, because I can't help but share this common feeling that cultural and political divisions are really engulfing the United States, and guns are really a common flashpoint. Over the past few years, I've had some opportunities to talk with groups that included diverse groups of people, as I think we have here, including many gun skeptics. And those experiences give me hope that we can, in fact, have productive conversations about the issue despite our differences. And let me just give you one case in point. So in 2023, I participated in a panel sponsored by the Vail Symposium called Conversations on Controversial Issues, and the topic was gun violence. Right? The other panelist pictured here, Josh Horwitz, right, who is the longtime executive director of one of the most prominent gun violence prevention organizations, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. And to his credit, Josh actually recommended to the organizers that I be on the panel with him, recognizing that we had different views of guns. Now, in 2 hours, we couldn't solve the wicked problem of gun violence, but the point of the event was not to solve the problem. The point of the event was to have a conversation. And I think that framing of conversation is vital because oftentimes we frame discussions of guns as debates, right? And if you think about it, you cannot win a conversation, right? You win a debate, you can't win a conversation. If you're that guy who tries to win a conversation at that party, you're the guy that nobody wants to talk to, right? Conversations are geared toward mutual understanding, right? They help to build empathy. Concern for the experiences and feelings of others is crucial to building a stronger democratic culture from the ground up. It helps us to see other people as fellow citizens and not as enemies, right? And this is the way that gun debates are often framed, as enemies fighting with each other. Conversations are fellow citizens trying to understand each other. Now, in the end, we will not, and we do not all have to agree, right? This is one of the beauties and challenges of living in a pluralistic democracy of over 300 million citizens. We must, however, disagree respectfully. Now, my final bonus lesson for you tonight is the overarching conclusion that I've come to in my work, right? Because I highlight the normality of guns and gun owners, some people see me as substituting a one-sided positive view for the one-sided negative view of guns that comes from the other side. But to the contrary, my overarching point is that we need to lean into the complexity of guns. Right? So I write in the conclusion to Gun Curious, if there is a single overarching lesson I have learned in my search for the truth about American gun culture, it is the importance of understanding that guns are not one thing, but many, and paradoxical at that. So we need to recognize that guns are lethal tools. And lethality, as the very smart people at Open Source Defense have put it, is a feature of firearms, not a bug, right? And because of their lethality, guns can make dangerous situations more deadly, right? And this helps to explain why, although the US is not particularly criminal compared to some of our peer nations, our criminal violence is much more deadly, right? And similarly, our rates of suicide are not particularly off the charts relative to our peer nations. So we rank about 14th out of 38 developed countries. We're between the Czech Republic and Germany in terms of overall suicide rate. But if you look just at the firearm suicide rate, we have 3 times the rate of the second most common nation, Finland. And this is because when people attempt suicide with firearms, they are most often successful, right? In over 90% or up to 90% of cases. So firearms are extremely deadly for those who attempt suicide, right? Because guns are, by design, lethal. But herein lies some of the paradox of guns, right? Despite the high rates of firearm homicide and suicide in the US relative to peer nations, I still insist that guns and gun ownership are not inherently associated with these negative outcomes, right? This is the paradox. So, as you can see, I hope, there were 46,728 gun deaths in 2023, the majority being suicide. Right? That's a large number. It's too large a number, right? And as we said, many gun violence prevention advocates in here, we need to make those numbers smaller, right? But it needs to be understood in the context of guns and gun owners in America, right? So considering that there are 86 million gun owners who have 400 million guns, we have to recognize that most guns and most gun owners are not implicated in this problem of homicide and suicide. In fact, the proportions are exceedingly small. So there's 1 gun death in America for every 1,840 gun owners, 54 thousandths of 1%. Okay? So to put that into some context, if you're familiar with the Golden Gate Bridge, 1.7 miles long, so 8,981 feet. So the ratio of gun deaths to gun owners is the same as taking 2 steps across the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Just 5 feet of that entire distance. And similarly, there's 1 gun death in America for every 8,560 guns, right? 12 thousandths of 1%. And in terms of the length of the Golden Gate Bridge, gun deaths per gun is about 1 foot of the length of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is not to minimize the pain and trauma that accompany gun-related deaths. But I do think a civil conversation about guns can benefit from understanding the gun violence that we all oppose in the broader context of the normality of guns and gun owners. So really, these data to me suggest we need to move from seeing guns as an either-or proposition to seeing them as a both-and proposition, right? Like the yin and yang. It's not yin or yang, right? It's yin and yang. Guns are fun and frightening, right? They're dangerous and protective. They're unifying and divisive, attractive and repulsive, bad and good. Seeing guns as paradoxical, as combining the yin and yang, helps us to escape what my friend Randy Mian calls the gun debate finger trap, right? Now, everybody got a finger trap when you came in? If not, Sandy didn't do her job, right? Those of you who are under 40 maybe don't know what these are. Everyone over 40 definitely knows what these are. Right? We used to call them Chinese finger traps. We don't call them Chinese finger traps anymore. They were never from China anyway. I don't know why we called them Chinese finger traps. Okay? So the finger trap is a perfect metaphor for the gun debate today. Right? The binary either-or thinking that plagues too many of our public debates about guns and gun violence has us trapped as the two sides pull against each other so hard that we just get stuck. Right? Uh-oh, can I still click? Yeah, I'm stuck. Okay, right? Guns are evil. Guns are good. Public safety, gun rights. You love your guns more than kids. From my cold dead hands. Destroyer of democracy. Savior of democracy. Right? All simplifications of a complex reality and false dichotomies that drive us apart from each other. Right? How do you release the tension in a finger trap? You have to move toward each other, right, to release the tension. So we need to move toward each other, right? Recall that all of us are in favor of gun safety, except our friend in the front. We're not sure. Okay? All of us are opposed to preventable gun deaths, right? This may seem cheesy, but I've actually been in a meeting where gun rights and gun control activists were asked to begin their discussion with things that they had in common, right? To find a common ground before they began debating policy. And it changed the entire tone of the conversation, right? We can release some of the tension in our gun debate finger trap by beginning with our commonalities. Now, in addition to finding this common ground, what if we reimagined the finger trap as a bridge that connected the two sides of the debate? Right? Anybody familiar with the song by the Judds, Love Can Build a Bridge? Right? Sandy introduced me to this song. I'm not going to ruin it by trying to sing it right now, but I have adapted it for my purposes to think about other things that can build a bridge over our national divide on guns. Right? So first of all, knowledge can build a bridge. Right? And this is a general hope that I had for Gun Curious, and it's been borne out in some small ways already. So a gun skeptic I know read the chapter on living with AR-15s and came away with a better understanding of why these rifles make sense to those who own them. And a gun nut I know read the chapter on guns as risk factors for negative outcomes and told me that he had more sympathy for gun violence prevention advocates, knowing the toll that guns take on some communities. And I like to believe that this is scalable if people will open their minds and hearts to learning something new, right? And how do we get people to do that? Right? The human desire to know and understand is intimately connected with curiosity. And I called my book Gun Curious for a lot of different reasons, but mostly because it reflected my own curiosity-driven search for the truth about guns. Right? However, as Scott Shigioka writes in his book Seek, when we use curiosity as a practice of connection instead of only as an intellectual exercise, the goal isn't to know, but to understand. Right? And here we come back to empathy. And I frequently invoke a passage from the philosopher Baruch Spinoza in my work. I have sedulously endeavored not to laugh at human actions, not to lament them, nor to detest them, but to understand them. Right? And Shigioka concludes, curiosity brings us closer to the humanity of the people around us, helping us to see and in turn be seen. So curiosity can build a bridge. Curiosity helps connect us to other people precisely because it reflects this desire to understand others and the world around us that's so crucial to building empathy, which is so crucial to building democratic culture. So in order to understand, we need to connect, and curiosity drives that connection. Those of you who are skeptical of guns have demonstrated curiosity by being here tonight, so thank you. Curiosity also builds bridges by getting us out of our echo chambers, right? And I know this because I really started to do this back in 2011. And because so many gun spaces are traditionally occupied by political conservatives, being a gun owner brought me out of my blue bubble. But again, of course, when I became a gun owner, I didn't cease being a liberal professor, but I have gotten to know many people who are demographically, politically, ideologically, and culturally different from me and my fellow liberal professors. And I now count as friends many gun owners, gun trainers, gun journalists, and even a member of the NRA's board of directors. And as I say in the final sentence of Gun Curious, my journey inside American gun culture has allowed me to meet, and in some cases even befriend, many people with whom I have little in common, right? Little other than our common citizenship and humanity. And recognizing that commonality may be the most important lesson of all. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.